You know, the reason we got so many sequels was that this was so popular, people were screaming for more. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and a brand new review series. With the upcoming release of Scream, or should I say Scream 5, I'm first going to be discussing all 4 of the other Scream movies. And once I do review Scream 5, I'm going to do a ranking video of all 5 Scream movies. So we're kicking things off with the original 1996's Scream. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time, and let's talk about Scream.
Hello?
This stars Neve Campbell as Sidney Prescott. A year after the murder of her mother, she's terrorized by a new killer who targets the girl and her friends by using horror films as part of a deadly game. So as I've previously done with my reviews of other older films, this will get into spoilers. So if you haven't seen Scream by now and you've avoided hearing anything about it all this time and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. Written by Kevin Williamson and directed by Wes Craven, this was at a time where horror movies were hitting a bit of a lull, namely slasher movies. A lot of what was getting released were just sequels to long-running franchises, a lot of which were getting released direct-to-video, and they were known heavily for their use of cliches. Yet despite it being labeled dead on arrival before it was even released, this revitalized the genre to brand new heights, and saw a surge in a whole new wave of slasher movies, many of which went on to become their own respective franchises. So this is a landmark movie. It launched the careers of many of its actors, most of whom were unknown at the time, and it became a pop culture sensation and a staple for horror fans, especially for teen horror fans, given its focus primarily on high school students. And it's something that, if you're a big horror buff, more than likely you've seen this at least once. This is probably one of the first big slasher movies I watched, along with A Nightmare on Elm Street, and it's probably one of the ones I've seen the most, where I almost know all the plot details by heart, beat by beat. And what helped too is that I also saw the first Scary Movie quite a few times as well, which parodied a lot of plot points from this movie, and it used to be a lot of fun to compare what they did in that movie versus what was originally done in Scream.
Do you like scary movies?
Mm-hmm.
What's your favorite?
I don't know.
Think.
Oh, I know. Kazam. You know, the one where Shaq plays a genie?
That's not a horror movie.
Well, you haven't seen Shaq act.
So even though I don't rewatch this as much now, I got my fair share of this for quite some time. And I think of all the big slasher movies, at least going strictly by the original movies, this is one of the most fun ones, if not the most fun. There are a few sequels to major slasher films that can be fun, but sometimes not for all the right reasons, and the original movies for a lot of these big franchises were meant to be serious. But this is arguably one of the most fun slasher movies around. It's not quite as scary outside of that opening sequence and a few other quick gruesome moments, but it's definitely a blast, and it holds a lot of rewatch value for how much it wants you to have fun with it. The big thing this is known for is its self-awareness and its characters' use of horror cliches to navigate their way through situations. Like, characters more or less say a number of times that they're essentially in a horror movie, and those who don't are often taking jabs at a lot of cliches. Like, there's a scene early on where Sydney's on the phone and she makes a comment about how she doesn't like horror movies because
what's the point? They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
there's a lot of shots taken at the genre like that from a lot of characters. It doesn't stop a few of them from meeting unfortunate fates or winding up in situations similar to those they criticize, but the self-awareness was nothing short of refreshing. We especially see it with Jamie Kennedy's Randy, who acts as the audience surrogate, and is the one who constantly explains the rules of horror movies to the other characters.
Jesus Christ, you don't know the rules?
Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
He's constantly getting on characters for making certain decisions, and at one point, he even gets up and he stops to tell everyone of certain things that you shouldn't do within horror movies.
Number 1, you can never have sex. Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
And a lot of these meta explanations provide a good chunk of their comedy, which, again, is something rare to see in a new major slasher movie. You did see it in these campy sequels, especially with A Nightmare on Elm Street, but it wasn't otherwise often, at least then, that a new major slasher movie would go for a lot of laughs. I don't know if I'd call it a straight up horror comedy. It's technically not classified as that, but I know there are quite a few people who do consider it that, and I get it if you do. It's certainly funny, but I personally don't think I'd put it quite on the same level as something like Shaun of the Dead or Tucker and Dale vs. Evil. It's very self-aware, but not every moment of self-awareness was necessarily looking to get a laugh. Like I said, it's an interesting mix where it's not necessarily scary all the time, but it's fun, even if not always funny, if that makes sense. But one of the exceptions to where it was pretty unnerving is that opening scene with Drew Barrymore, which is arguably the film's most famous scene. For one thing, it works so well for just how creative it is at getting under your skin, with the way it gradually builds up from a flirty phone call, to movie trivia, to Ghostface being pushy, before finally getting to the big chase. That's probably one of the most inventive sequences in a major slasher movie. But it's also so well known for how much of a shock it was, because Drew Barrymore was by far the biggest star at the time, and it especially wasn't common for big name actors to appear in horror movies. And here, her interest was actually what caused Wes Craven to stay on as a director, as he initially was going to leave the project. But she was initially supposed to play Sidney before scheduling conflicts came up, and she opted to go for the smaller role of Casey in the opening scene. But they still plastered her all over the promotional material for the movie, and made everyone think she was going to play this huge role before delivering this surprising first kill of the movie, or really second kill. Her boyfriend goes before her. But it offered a nice subversion of expectations that no one's safe. If your most famous actor didn't even make it past the first scene, then anything goes. And that set the tone nicely for the rest of the film, especially as it needed to make things clear to the audience that this isn't going to be like your typical horror movie. There's also a solid mystery element to it that makes it so refreshingly unique. With movies like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and nearly all these other slashers, it's usually just always one person. You know who it is right from the get-go, and all the suspense was just wondering when that person's going to show up. This draws its suspense from two different places. One is, you don't know when Ghostface is going to show up next, and two, you don't even know who he is. There's a great whodunit aspect of the film that lingers over the entire movie, which is something that's been copied into each sequel, and makes each of them feel a little unique, even if it is a spin on the same formula. Even though they all feature Ghostface, you get a different version of the character each time with different motivations. I also just like the look of the costume. It's very simple, but it's effective at conveying this menacing presence. The striking facial expression on the mask reflects the look of terror that you're meant to feel whenever he appears, and what especially adds to it is the stealth exhibited as he sneaks around or chases after someone. And even though again, I'd say this is more fun than scary, whenever he suddenly appears, that shocking element of surprise works well for those distinct characteristics. I'm usually not a fan of jump scares at all, but because they weren't used excessively here, and in some cases they were incorporated in ways that were meant to feel self-aware or satirical, like someone commenting, "This is when they suddenly appear," or whatever it is, it works well.
Careful. This is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life for one last scare.
But what also makes this work well is that you have a strong central character at the forefront of all this. I'd say Sidney is by far one of the stronger horror protagonists. For one thing, I thought Neve Campbell's performance was rock solid, but just from a writing standpoint, she's given a clear arc where she's haunted by the death of her mother a year prior, and it's traumatized her to this day. And she's fighting through that pain while also dealing with being stalked by this killer. Like, you have this mini subplot where the man convicted of her mother's death, Cotton Weary, played by Liev Schreiber, is suspected to be innocent, and then there are also all these issues she has with her boyfriend Billy, played by Skeet Ulrich, because she has difficulty moving on, and I liked how a lot of that tied together while still being this great slasher movie and a great mystery movie. Plus, she's also clearly smarter than most other horror protagonists. Now, she does fall into some of the same traps that she criticizes, like when I mentioned earlier about how she makes that comment about going up the stairs instead of the front door. She literally does that not too long after, which I think was a subtle joke thrown in there. But there's clearly more of a wit and cunning edge to her, and I liked how there was considerably more to her personality besides the trauma she's enduring. It gives us more to work with so that we have even stronger reasons to root for her, and it just makes things more emotionally satisfying when she goes into more of a badass mode later on during the final confrontations. The supporting cast was fine overall. My favorite by far was Jamie Kennedy as Randy, who was the most enjoyable in terms of adding all these meta references and explanations of horror cliches. There's actually a really fun moment with him that didn't fully click with me until I'd say this most recent rewatch, where he's watching Halloween on his couch couch and he's talking to Jamie, being Jamie Lee Curtis's Laurie Strode, about getting away from Michael Myers. And as that's happening, Ghostface appears behind him, and it's almost as if he's talking to himself as to what to do, along with Sidney yelling at him over the monitor, since the actor's name is Jamie, and I thought that was cool. Courtney Cox as Gail Weathers was good. She's clearly more antagonistic for the majority of the film, with a very self-centered, angry demeanor, and I think Courtney Cox's performance was solid, and there are some funny exchanges as a result of how sharp she was, and I'm glad they had her help out in the third act, but giving her this almost misunderstood, very suddenly sympathetic edge towards the later part of the movie was whatever to me. Like, I could have taken or left the romance with David Arquette's Dewey. Maybe because I thought he was just an alright character too. Now, I know he's a big fan favorite, like Gail is, and that's why they've remained in the series for as long as they have, and I get the joke with his character is that he's a deputy and he still kind of acts like a child, but I don't know. It's maybe a bit too whiny for me. Arquette doesn't do a bad job. It's at times funny, but I think it's a little grating in some instances. If anything, I found Rose McGowan as Tatum to be more enjoyable personally. And what I also really like is when we get to the final act. Once we get to the party at Stu's house, that's where you get hit with all these red herrings and all these twists that really start having you question everyone and everything even more so, which is something I really enjoyed about this, how it always kept you on your feet guessing. Now, there is a bit of a lull in the pacing at one point, which is one of my only complaints with the movie, like the stuff with Dewey and Gail's whatever to me, and the film has to refocus a little once the majority of the kids at the party leave because they find out their principal was killed, which by the way was a nice cameo by Henry Winkler, and there's just a brief moment where things quiet down where it was alright. But once Ghostface fully reemerges after this, so right during the moment I mentioned earlier where Randy's watching TV, that's where it really gets great. I especially like the disorienting feel where it's going in all these different directions, like in one instance where you have Randy and Stu each begging Sidney to let them in the house and accusing one another of being the killer.
Stay back! Who did it? You really shoot Mike! Who did it? No, I didn't! Please give me that gun!
I thought that was a great way of upping the stakes. And then everything from the reveal that the killers are Billy and Stu on is excellent. That's top-notch stuff right there. For one thing, even though this is considerably more grounded than most other horror movies, I do like its somewhat more over-the-top nature. Because you have Matthew Lillard and Skeet Ulrich just reveling in how evil they are, especially for their entirely different motivations. You have Billy, who has this whole thought-out revenge plot due to an affair Sidney's mom had with his dad, and then you have Stu, who just says so nonchalantly that it's because of
Peer pressure. I'm far too sensitive.
I liked how you had not just two killers, which allowed for so much more to be done here, but you also went in the two most polar opposite directions with each of their motivations. One has this whole concrete backstory as a reasoning, while the other just seems to be pure evil, which I'd argue is considerably more menacing. And then there are still great bits of dark humor in there, all the way till the end, with more references to tropes seen in horror movies, plus Matthew Lillard still kind of acting like a whiny teenager despite being revealed as the killer was pretty funny.
Did you really call the police?
You bet your sorry ass I did.
My mom and dad are gonna be so mad.
And it still adds to the overall sense of fun, so there's a nice tonal consistency that I appreciated. I just say that, while I really enjoy the film, I'd also say it's not perfect. I already went over my main criticisms regarding there being a brief lull in pacing and not being the biggest fan of some of the characters, but for something more mixed, I just say that this is a very 90s movie. Like, along with The Craft and I Know What You Did Last Summer, this bleeds 90s teen horror. From the way it was shot to its very on-the-nose soundtrack, which I think is where it's most noticeable. Like, this sometimes isn't subtle when it wants you to feel tense or scared. That's a big reason why I wouldn't say this is particularly scary. Like, there are some gory, brutal kills here that are unsettling, but in terms of building suspense through its score, to call it very obvious would be an understatement. Like, when it builds up, it gets loud, like really loud, to the point it overpowers everything else. I also get that it's a product of its time in that regard, and this isn't unique to that film, as I've seen it in a few other 90s movies. It's just one of those things where, especially if you haven't seen too many 90s movies in a while, then you go back to this one, it hits you like a ton of bricks. It does feel a bit dated in that regard. It's something that probably I'd get used to if I rewatch this a few more times, but considering this is the first time I've watched it in a while, I almost forgot about that, and it was a bit distracting at times. Another thing is, going hand in hand with that to a degree, while I still stand by the film's great whodunit plot point, I will say that once you know who the killers are, it becomes quite obvious when you go back and watch everything else, at least when it comes to one of them. I wouldn't say Stu is quite as obvious, as he's a little weird but trying to be funny, but Billy being one of the killers is handled about as on the nose as they come. I get it's a big plot detail that he shows up with blood on him at one point, and that's how he gets thrown into jail for a little bit, and part of the tension stems from whether or not he specifically is the killer. But this guy is creepy. Like, it's obvious how much of a weird dude he is. There's not exactly a charm to him. Like, even though Stu says some weird, creepy things too, it's his attempt at being funny. Billy, on the other hand, always gives off this menacing look. He doesn't even pretend to have any sort of empathy or compassion to him. He always has this don't mess with me look to him, and that he's about to flip on you at the drop of a dime. And on top of the fact that he always shows up at the wrong place at the wrong time, it's teed up that he's the killer in like one of the most obvious ways going.
Is your brain leaking? My mom was killed. I can't believe you're bringing this up.
I know, it's been a year. Maybe your movie-freaked mind lost its reality button. You ever think of that?
What do I have to do to prove to you that I'm not a killer?
He's got killer printed all over his forehead.
I do like how they try throwing you off a few times where Ghostface shows up even when Billy's in the room or incapacitated, but given the reveal, it's really not that quite surprising if you think about it. I think when you're seeing it for the first time, it might not quite feel that way just because there's also so much going on and you don't know who's who. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that this was very atypical for a horror movie at the time, so I'm trying to understand it in that regard. But seeing it now, knowing what I know, while it's still a lot of fun, it's just pretty on the nose in terms of who it is. Scream is a landmark horror film that's still just as much fun now as it was when it was first released. While parts of it clearly are a product of its time, and it can be a little on the nose in some regards, it's still a very funny, exciting, self-aware satire on the horror genre, filled with a slew of memorable sequences and characters that give it a lot of rewatch value and make it a horror classic. Scream gets an 8.5 out of 10. So stay tuned, as up next will be my review of Scream 2. And in the meantime, let me know, did you see Scream, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Is this one of your favorite horror movies? Are you looking forward to the new movie? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.